Welcome to the introduction to Azure Infrastructure as a Service. My name is Arno. I'm an Azure architect here in Singapore, and we're going to spend the next few hours together reviewing the fundamentals of Azure Infrastructure as a Service. In this first session, we are going to uncover the Azure Infrastructure overview. So what's in it for this first session? Well, first discovering what is the Microsoft Azure IaaS platform, understanding what are the technology and the building blocks that you are using to deploy your technologies, your virtual machine, your network and your storage, and we will basically understand the underlying technology that would allow you to adopt what we call hybrid cloud. So let's get started. And the agenda is very simple. First, cloud computing and Microsoft Azure. Second, building your cloud toolbox. And at last, the last module, we're going to review together the Azure Resource Management 101, so the very fundamentals of getting started with managing a subscription and managing the cost of a subscription. Let's get started with the cloud computing and Microsoft Azure. So when we're talking about cloud, we have various models for cloud services delivery. We have software as a service, where basically you bring the data and all the intelligence is processed by the cloud provider. You have platform as a service, where basically you bring your application, you bring your SQL database, and basically everything is managed by the cloud provider. And you have infrastructure as a service, IaaS, which basically provides you with a highly reliable infrastructure, and then you bring your own virtual machine, your own compute power. So if we are reviewing at Azure platform, we bring basically the IaaS and the PaaS solutions for you. Now, if you review at the cloud responsibility models, in basically the infrastructure as a service model, as we mentioned, Microsoft brings to you the virtualization platform, relying on highly available server, storage and networking infrastructure. And on top of that, you bring your own virtual machine, might be Windows, might be Linux, you bring your own workloads. So compare with the platform as a service, where you basically just bring your code or your SQL database and everything is managed by Azure, and you don't need to care about virtual machine and the underlying technology. So that's pretty much the responsibility model that we use into the different cloud operating models. So what are the solutions that Microsoft has for you in terms of cloud? Well, you know, for many years the Windows Server and System Center coupled, that is basically the private cloud solution that you have to do your very DIY cloud solution that you can very tailor to your need. You have also the public cloud, which basically consists of the very well-known Office 365, Microsoft Intune for managing the devices, and Dynamics 365, sorry. Azure is also one of the elements of that, and this is what we're going to cover today. We see private and public, but there's basically a series of variations that we have in between, and this is called hybrid cloud. So what is hybrid cloud and what do we have in solution? Well, basically we have a model where customers can leverage Microsoft Azure and the advantage of public cloud, and using our highly available cloud infrastructure to run their Windows Server and Linux. But we also have another opportunity to run the data center on premises. So if a customer is running under a highly regulated or a disconnected environment, we have the possibility to use the same exact infrastructure on customer premise. So basically using the same API, using the same Azure Resource Managers models, you can basically run workloads on the same way inside Microsoft Azure or inside Azure Stack. This experience of Azure Stack is basically an integrated system, so we work closely with Dell EMC, HPE, Lenovo, Cisco and others in order to provide a solution which is already integrated, because we know that basically on-premise and deployments are usually very difficult based on the integration of the different components that are basically composing the infrastructure. So this is why we work with those providers to provide you with an already integrated experience where you already have the Azure experience and the Azure look and feel when you're deploying the environment. So what is it all about when we're talking about Azure infrastructure? So basically we have the compute, network and storage. This is the very building blocks of an infrastructure. So these are the components that we're going to review during this video, but we're going to cover as well a couple of elements that are related to basically the monitoring and management, and as well as the security and identity, because you want to achieve with the cloud as well the best operational excellence and the best level of security that you can possibly achieve. So what is Azure? It's 42 what we call region. It's basically point of presence in a region. It represents around 150 data center. Actually, it's more than that, and it's more than 1 million physical servers, all being defined as a software-defined networking, software-defined storage. Everything is software-defined and is Microsoft engineering. As you know, Microsoft is also one of the biggest IP and fiber networks. So basically what it takes to be present everywhere in the world is to have the highest possible bandwidth and the lowest latency possible between the data center. So yes, we have dark fibers that makes the connection between the data center, and you have different connection entry point that you have to have the most reliable connectivity, and we're going to cover that into a later module. So how does a data center looks like? This is a view from the sky. So you can see that there are different parts representing different generation of the data center. You can see another view of the data center, and just for your reference, you can see the scale with the truck, a full-size truck that you see on the road. This is another angle on this data center, and this is what we built lately on this environment. So you can see that this is a huge investment and a huge basically technology investment that we're doing and that we are building. This is another data center. This is Quincy in Washington State, and this is another one, Netherlands. So basically the data center is in the foreground. The background is just a greenhouse because we are in Amsterdam, so that's a West Europe data center. Another view of Cheyenne data center, and now this is the view from the inside of the data center. So this is kind of a very standardized data center. It looks like a dream for a data center guy. Everything is well organized and well structured. Well, how does it work, and what's inside that? Basically, all the hardware is engineered and delivered, ready to go. It's delivered in rack, it's prepared, and it's cabled into the data center. And what's inside that, the Azure cloud hardware? Well, we basically do the engineering and learning years after years on how to build this infrastructure. And we contribute to the Open Compute project. So every innovation that we do, we publicly document it and is available. The result of that optimization is, of course, savings on the cost of the hardware, savings in terms of energy consumption, and basically improvement in terms of cabling, and as a consequence of the all cabling and all everything being inbound integrated already is the start of operation, which is way faster. So an Open Cloud Server V2, this is how it looks like. So you see that you have basically 40 gigs NIC with RDMA over Converged Ethernet. You have a Xeon CPU, you have M2 flash SSD, and a bunch of HDD on the servers. This is the page on Open Compute where you can see those information and have a quick look at the very different elements of the infrastructure. There's a new generation coming, and with the new generation that we call Project Olympus, we are basically pushing it to the next level with a new universal motherboard, a new highly available power supply and standardized power supply in the world, and basically a standard-based server and rack management system. So how does it look like? An environment for Project Olympus. It's pretty much the evolution of the environment. So now we're relying on 50 gigs networking. We are having NVMe SSDs in the environment, and same thing, next generation of Xeon in the environment. This is delivered as a rack, as we mentioned. So you can see that basically at the very bottom you have the storage, and we mentioned previously that this is all basically software-defined. So software-defined storage is just JBOD, just a bunch of disks, and this is actually Azure Fabric that manages the redundancy and the virtualization of the storage. On top of that, you see that you have the servers that are doing basically the compute power, the virtual machine, the hypervisors. Then you have the data networking switch, so the data plane of basically the different tenants that are relying on Azure. And you see that you have as well the server management switch, so basically the control plane of the environment. And then you see that in the back of the rack you see the PDU, the power distribution unit, that is available and standardized as well. This is for the very quick overview of the hardware infrastructure around Azure. Now, as an Azure user, what is the toolbox that we need to compose and the tools that we need to use? Well, very simple. This is just a very quick extract of the different tools that you have available. If you want more, you can go on aka.ms/Azure Toolbox, and you have a whole range of tools that are available into the different area of Azure infrastructure. But let's get a quick overview on that. Basically, you will interact first with the UI, so with the portal. You can do your first deployment, your testing, and the very initial basically exploration of the environment, but much more likely, once you are getting more and more used to cloud, you will use language to do the automation and scripting environment. So probably PowerShell would be your next best friend, or would be Azure CLI, or even the Cloud Shell. There's also System Center, Visual Studio, Visual Studio Code. A whole range of third-party application also implements Azure API, so that you can basically leverage and control Azure from their application. Let's review some of them. So this is the portal, portal.azure.com. This is what we use to deploy virtual machine, manage virtual machine, and access to the control plane of your cloud deployments. We're going to see that in a demo in a couple of minutes. You also have PowerShell. So PowerShell is present on Windows or on Linux. You can use that, and here we have Get Azure RM VM. You can list the virtual machines that are running right now into your environment. Get Azure RM location. Just a quick example. You can use also the CLI environment. So this is here available on Windows, Linux, and Mac. And you can also have access to a containerized version of the CLI by the instruction that you see here. So you have a Docker container ready that includes that CLI environment. You can also have a Cloud Shell. So basically on the portal that I showed in a couple of seconds ago, you also have access to Cloud Shell, so you can directly open a shell into your web browser and have access to the environment and have access to the storage where you can put your scripting available and your tooling available there. You also have a virtual machine manager. So System Center Virtual Machine Manager allows you to interact with your Azure subscription. So you can see the different VMs that you are running on your Azure subscription. You can manage the backup and disaster recovery options for your on-premise environment being replicated to Azure Public Cloud. Another control that you have is with Visual Studio that you see here. You can basically directly from your IDE access to the running virtual machine, deploy a new virtual machine, storage account, all Azure infrastructure constructs. Also third-party tools. So for instance, if you are using canonical Juju, so you have charms for Juju that are available, and that helps you deploying and control the deployments of virtual machine inside Azure. Another provider that we see quite often as well is Terraform, and Terraforms offer you the possibility to address Azure as well in ASM or ARM, the latest mode, and you basically configure Terraform for it, and you can describe your resources and deploy them to Microsoft Azure transparently. Very important aspects of Azure. Now that we see the infrastructure and the toolbox, what are the administrative models? How do you deploy resources and how do you control them in the cloud? So first aspect, very important aspect of Azure is Azure Resource Manager. So Azure Resource Manager is a way to basically describe, deploy and control your resources. And this is a very fundamental element of Azure, whether it's Azure on the public side or Azure into the private side, Azure Stack. So the very interesting point with Azure Resource Manager is that it allows you to control, describe resources and deploy resources in public cloud or in the private version of a hybrid cloud. So ARM comes with basically that templatization and that templatized language that basically supports infrastructure as code. This is a very fundamental aspect of it. But also this is the way that we describe resources that we deploy in Azure, and that allows you to do the role-based access control, and it basically describes everything that you deploy into an Azure subscription. So fundamental aspects of that is a resource group. So when you deploy something in Azure, it's always in a resource group. So a resource group is basically a way to put resources together, and as we mentioned, this could be IaaS elements, so you can put into a resource group virtual machine, storage and network elements, but you can also very much deploy database in the pass form as a database, or you can put as well the web server, web service, app service inside a resource group as well. So you can put basically all the things that you need into a resource group. So a resource group namely is an administration element that you would use to segregate access to the environment. So basically the boundary of administration for an Azure service is still the subscription. So that's the entire world for an Azure tenant. But what we do usually is we create resource group, and resource group is a great way to delegate access to resources. So the next question would be then, how do you do the resource grouping? And the answer is, it depends. Well, it depends on basically what are your administration models and what are administration's boundaries. Likely in small organization, you might want to put all the resources that describe the same service in the same resource group. So let's say the web service, the virtual machine, the storage account. As long as it's the same users that need to have access to the resource, it kind of makes sense to put them in the same resource group. If you have a bigger organization and maybe you still have a separation of duties when you have a database administrator, virtual machine administrator, storage administrator, then it might make sense as well to have different resource group and delegate the access on those different resource group. A very important aspect of Azure administration as well is what we call resource tagging. And resource tagging basically allows you to put, as the name mentioned, tags on a resource. Why it is very important? Because inside the subscription you might have different workloads from different business units into an organization. But what tells you that it is basically something which is dev and test, something that is production from different BU. So you need to have something that is actually transversal of all the resources inside the subscription. So basically if you create, for instance, different resource groups, so you create a resource group for accounting, a resource group in your subscription for engineering, then those different resource groups will contain very likely workloads that are for production, workloads that are for dev and test, and workloads that are for QA. So the usage of resource tagging is actually a very good way to attach that notion that is across all different resource groups. And why we would use tagging? Well, first for the administration, for knowing that this is a workload that is related to this kind of activity. But secondly as well, might be for billing. So you might use the tagging to do transversal different site of sorting. You want to have a cost evaluation of all your dev and test environment, for instance, then you can do that with the resource tagging. You can query all the tags and then evaluate the cost associated with that. That's one of the examples of resource tagging options. Very strongly encourage you to do that, because with clouds basically you will deploy more and more resources and you want to have a very quick view on what is what. As we mentioned previously, you have with ARM a role-based access control. So basically at the top of the pyramid you see that subscription is the very administration boundary, and on top of this subscription you can define different roles. So we have stereotyped roles that you can then further customize, but basically you can define contributors, owners and readers that cannot do any change, just see the configuration. And inside this subscription you can have different resource groups, as you mentioned. The different resource group could be based on business unit, or can be technical resource group based on different kind of service. And inside the resource group you have different level of resources. So basically you have access inheritance model. So if you define an access to contributors to some resource group, well basically the access will be inherited to the child object. So it's basically you to define the right model for the organization and the right resource grouping to delegate the role-based access control to that environment. A very important aspect also of Azure resources management is resource locks. So resource lock is a very great way to avoid mistakes. We all know the situation where you accidentally delete a virtual machine. Quite uncomfortable situation, whether it's still on the old data center world or still in the cloud, in the new cloud world, is both very annoying. So in order to avoid that, we have a construct which is called the resource lock, which you can put on top of a virtual machine or any resource that you have on Azure. And as a consequence, even if you're an administrator, even if you have full global admin right on your Azure subscription, you cannot delete a resource. You have to go to the resource lock, remove the lock, and delete, and then only after you remove the lock you can delete or you can modify the resources. So can be very much of a lifesaver as well, the resource lock. Very important aspect of your resource management as well is the cost management and the cost optimization. So when you go to your Azure portal, you have access to your basically billing information, and we recently integrated Cloudin as a cost management solution. So when you go to your Azure portal, this is what you see. This is your management dashboard. So it's a very cheap environment that I show you in this environment. It's just to show you that you have the overall view of the cost of my subscription and the different elements of the cost of the subscription here. So you have the cost controller that allows you to see the projection of the cost for the very next few months, the cost by the different Azure subscription that you might have. So here I only have the Visual Studio subscription, but I can put a different subscription of my environment and then have an aggregated view on all those different elements. I can also have an asset controller, have an optimizer in order to investigate on whether the resource consumption is done appropriately. So if I have many VMs with very low CPU utilization, then you can have probably some further optimization here and basically save money. Very important aspect, when you do your first deployment on Azure, you want to estimate how much the deployment is going to cost you. So for that you can use our Azure pricing calculator, which is online and allows you to basically evaluate the amount of virtual machine, the amount of storage that you will need for your deployment, and what is the estimated cost. Now, of course, the cloud world will have very dynamic costing ID, so you will have the estimation and then you will have the reality, which usually it would be quite lower. Another very important aspect is when you are building your solution, you want to evaluate what would be the cost of the very equivalent solution deployed on a data center. And it's very tough because you need to know what is the cost of a highly available infrastructure like Azure. So we have something called Azure TCO calculator, tco.microsoft.com, and that allows you to basically review the cost of a virtual machine inside a typical data center with the same redundancy that Azure provides you with, so that you are able to really compare apple to apple with highly available storage, highly available networking. What would be the cost of the same equivalent solution in a data center world? So that's easily, and that's easing the conversation that you would have with your management probably. So now in our slides, let's just go to the demo and have a quick overview together of first the Azure portal and Azure command line interfaces, a little bit of Azure Resource Manager, the delegation of the role, and maybe a few additional tidbits. Alright, so here we are. This is the Azure portal. This is where everything happens. So this is the UI interface where basically you can create different resources. So here you have access to compute, network, and storage, which is the main purpose of this series of sessions. You can see that actually the first screen that you see is usually the dashboard. So dashboard allows you to basically have a quick view on all the resources that are deployed in your environment. You can have multiple dashboards and you can customize them based on what you need to be efficient. So have a quick view on your virtual machine running, for instance, the different resource group, different elements of your infrastructure. So here in this environment, you're able to see the different elements that are defined as favorites, and you see that by default you have here the resource group. Now, as I mentioned, a resource group is the way to put things that you deploy in Azure together. So here, if I go to demo RG, for instance, for demo resource group, you have all the list of things that I put into this resource group. So it is just the machine that I use for the purpose of this demo here today. Now we have discussed about a couple of resources previously. So you can actually add a tag to an environment. So actually tag is a way to put commands on a resource or find back what the resource is all about. So usually what we would recommend is that you define basically a couple of tags to define, for instance, so who owns the resource, what business unit is running it, is it type for production or dev and test. So probably you can start doing that, putting just value owner, and you put then here Jackie, for instance. And here you can add a new tag, so you can run type, and here you can type PRD. So the advantage of that is that then you are able to do basically queries across all your subscription and across the different resource groups that are present in your environment. So that's one of the great way to find back very quickly what an environment is all about. As you mentioned previously as well, a way to delegate access to resources in Azure is probably to manage that at the resource group level. So if we define a resource group that is managed by a group of users, let's say you can go there into the access control pane, and then you are able here to add new users and roles to this environment. So you have to define first what kind of role you want to delegate to that specific user. So here I'm going to define a role of contributor to one of the guys in my team. So allow me to allow this guy basically to contribute to this environment, which is modifying a configuration. So we can search, for instance, guys that are in my team. So I can put Ricky here at Microsoft, and then this guy, when it goes to his Azure subscription, is going to be able to have a list of all the environment, including the one I'm delegating access to right now. So I'll just have to do save here, and the next step is to validate and grant him access to the environment. So now onward, this guy will see that environment in his Azure portal. So that's the very interesting aspect that we have out of Azure role-based access control. Now, other aspects that you want to explore out of the portal is basically the cost management, as we mentioned previously. So I'm going to go now in another environment where I can see the cost, and you can see that here I'm in cost management pane and the cost management icon, and I'm going there, and it's going to open another window that allows me to view what has been consumed into this very precise environment, and to do the projection around the next few months. So the dashboard is going to load, and here you see that I have my management dashboard, the cost controller, asset controller, optimizer, and depending if I have the premium version of the free version that is present with the subscription, then I would be able to compare costs across different types of environment. So here I go to the cost controller, and I'm able to see that yes, I spend that amount of money since this month, and then I'm able to dig in further into the summary of this cost and the precise here breakdown on what is the trend by month, by day, and what are the services that we see. So here we go. That's here a very small environment that I not use that much, but it's just to show the example of how to make data out of a cloud-in environment. So if we go back there, one of the very important aspects that we are using, that we want to cover with Azure, is the toolbox. So usually what I would recommend is that you have a quick view of here the different tools that we might have for you. So just a quick recap that I did on my blog. One of the aspects that we want with Azure, first aspect is determine is my basically deployment going to happen in this or this specific region. So for that, a good practice consists to use Azure Speed. So you can go on azurespeed.com here, and you would have a view on the latency from your current connection to the different Azure environments. So here you can basically uncheck all the environment, and here we are in Singapore now, so the question is, should I use East Asia, Southeast Asia, Japan, East and West, Australia, Southeast? So I'm in Singapore, so hopefully this one will come first. So here we see Singapore with the average latency and the closest data center, and you see the variation of this latency. So it's usually a good practice to have a quick check here if this is actually relevant, and if the majority of your user would be there, it would be good to make sure of it. So then you have different other additional tools, but that's the main one that we use when we want to have this view in the environment. I showed you the basically the portal, but very soon when you want to get faster with Azure and do repetitive tasks, as soon as you need to do a task more than once, you probably want to automate that. So you have a PowerShell that you can use on Windows. So it all starts with logging Azure RM account. Yep. And here you'll be prompted for the authentication. So you put your credentials. You're going to do your sign-in into an interactive Windows to the rich authentication context. And here, since I'm already authenticated into this environment, we can see that this is my subscription. And then I can start playing with get, for instance, Azure RM VM. So get Azure Resource Manager virtual machines. And then if I validate, I would see all the data around the virtual machines that I'm running here. So we can see that probably I should do a filtering to see a little bit better the resources, but I see that this machine is in demo RG resource group. This is a standard B2S virtual machine. We're going to see that in a couple of minutes. But this is how we interact with the environment in PowerShell. Now, if you're using a Mac or a Linux, or you prefer to use another command line context, we also have AZ. So AZ is this command line, and the advantage of that is this is the same exact syntax, whether you're on different platforms. So here you can do, for instance, AZ login. That's the context for authenticating. And here we have a slightly different way to authenticate. So we need to go to KAMS/device login to do a browser-based authentication. And if I go there and I put the authentication code, then it would ask me to validate that it is the credentials that I want to use. So here, let's use the same credentials. And eventually, the context will get authentified as well. So here you're having the different subscription that I have access to, and you can do basically different operations. So if I do AZ VM here, you observe that I can do AZ VM, create, delete, allocate. It's slightly different syntax than PowerShell. PowerShell is more like the verb and then the noun that you're using. Here is pretty much the other way around, is AZ, then VM, and then create and do the action on the VM. So that's pretty much what I wanted to show you for the first demo around Azure. Let's see more in further modules. This is it for the demo. Now let's recap what we've seen during this session. First, Azure Infrastructure and Innovation is here to help you build enterprise class applications. You have Azure Resource Manager, which is the administrative model that you use, and when you're using ARM, you describe resources that can be deployed on Azure Public Cloud and as well on Azure private side with Azure Stack. So your investments, the deployment that you're going through cloud models is very much usable in both worlds without much of a change. You can use Cloudin to manage your cost and spending of your subscription and optimization on your subscription. And to get started on the right fit, you can use our toolbox that you can find on aka.ms/Azure Toolbox with a whole wealth of resources for you to get started with Azure. Couple of customer studies. You can go on customers.microsoft.com. You are able to search per regions and per technology what are the different use cases that we see in the region, and you will also have a couple of additional links at the bottom of the session that you can refer to very own regional cases that we've done with customers here in Singapore, Philippines, and the very nearby countries. Thank you very much for attending this first session. Stay tuned for the very next topics in the next few days. Thanks very much. You can go to the blog aka.ms/rno, and you can find me on Twitter. More than happy to connect with you there as well. Thank you very much.
Yes. Hello everyone. So thank you for attending this first session on Azure webinar series. So we're going to look through the questions. So feel free also to post additional questions. We got a lot of questions during the session. Arno is online with me to respond to the different questions you posted. So the first one was about having more information in terms of comparison between private and public cloud from Jamil. So Arno, can you tell me, can you tell us more about this main comparison topics?
Yeah, so basically in terms of different cloud models, if you look at the NIST definition, that's the National Institute for Standard in Technology in the US, so that's usually the standard I refer to because I haven't found any better definition. So when you define cloud, it's basically using via the network a set of resources that are shared, that are elastic, that are pay on demand using self-provisioning. So that's the main characteristic of a cloud. Then you have different kinds of cloud, which is PaaS, SaaS, and IaaS, which were the topic that we covered today. And you have three types of deployments, which are public, private, or hybrid. So public basically is running on somebody else's premise, so Microsoft, for instance, here, and it is basically shared among multiple tenants. So multiple customers are running in the same environment, whereas private is basically something that is very dedicated usually to one customer or one set of business units for the same customer. So you don't share with external entities. Then you have hybrid mode, which is basically what most organizations use, which is somewhere in between. So a little bit of public cloud where it makes sense and a little bit of private cloud where it makes sense. And you also have another mode, which is basically the community mode for cloud, which is something for community sharing interests. For instance, a group of, I don't know, different organizations that are being accumulated and bought together over time. But that's the main types of cloud and the difference between private and public.
Yeah, very clear, Arno, thank you. So you talk about cloud migration, which is obviously a key topic, migrating for on-premise environments. So for the audience, you have to know that in the series we will have a specific session on migration to Azure. But to respond to one questions, can you shortly brief us on what Microsoft proposed as a solution to migrate on-premise VM to Azure?
That's a very good question, because actually we just announced a release a couple of days ago of a new service called Azure Migrate. So when you do the migration, actually there's a couple of things that you want to make sure. First is all the prerequisites are being met. So let's say we have tools that allow you to migrate machines from Hyper-V inside your data center to Azure. You have the same comparative tools, the comparable tool that allows you to migrate VMware or even physical servers to Azure. Now the question is, it has some prerequisites to be checked. So the size of the disk, for instance, the type of boot technology, do you use UEFI or do you use BIOS? Then it has some constraints. That's the tools that we're using for migration. So Azure Migrate basically allows you to manage a project or migration project. So the way it works is first do the assessment for you. So you download a virtual appliance that we basically then set up on your data center, and it's going to connect to your vCenter or your vSphere, and it's going to basically study first the configuration of the virtual machine, and then it's going to study as well, very important, the utilization of the virtual machine. Because usually the problem when we migrate to cloud is to say, oh, okay, so we have a machine that has 16 cores and 32 gigs of RAM. That's good. So when you do the migration to Azure, you say, okay, so I need to provision the price for a machine with that amount of CPU cores and that amount of RAM. Now, do you use that? Are those resources actively being used, or the CPU utilization is always 1 or 2% and the RAM utilization is always, let's say, 10 gig? Then basically what Azure Migrate allows you to do is to say, hey, this is the configuration that we checked, but based on the last week's performance analysis, probably we can downsize this virtual machine when we do the cloud migration, and then very much do some savings on the deployment. So that's a very important aspect of Azure Migrate, and you can put things with projects as well, so that allows you to evaluate the cost of migrating all of those VMs together in Azure. And a very important aspect that you can do as well is evaluating the dependencies. So let's say, for instance, we are evaluating a web server, and usually when you want to go migration, you discover all kinds of other servers that communicate with that. So there's a part of Azure Migrate, which is called Service Map, that allows you to study the dependency, all the other servers that are discussing with this precise machine, and then you can study that, oh, maybe in my migration plan I forgot this and this server, so I can integrate that into my study and maybe put it into the migration plan. So this is just for the phase of studying the migration, verifying the prerequisites. And it will give you advice, as I mentioned, on which type of VM, but it also assesses the possibility to migrate the data to PaaS platforms. So if it's a SQL server, then maybe you want to study as well with the database migration wizard the possibility to migrate to the PaaS mode. But very basically, once we've done this study, we can do basically the moving of the virtual machine. So for the moving of the virtual machine, the technology that we leverage is basically called Azure Site Recovery, ASR, and that actually replicates the full content of your virtual machine as it runs in production environment without interruption of service, and replicate that to Azure. And then at any time, once the replication is finished, of course, you can basically restart the VM inside Azure, inside the test network. So you can validate that everything when it's up in the cloud works fine, and then once you're done and you're verifying that everything is done, you can just click finish migration, and then we stop replicating, doing the final replication, and then the VM runs in the cloud.
Great. We had a question about related also to this offering about data for the users in only either Microsoft or Cloudin. Can you tell us a little bit more about the relationship between Cloudin and Microsoft?
So yeah, basically Cloudin used to be an external company that we acquire. So basically now Cloudin data is basically processed and following Microsoft policies. So that's not anymore a third party that we are sharing your consumptions data with. That's Microsoft.
That's so completely aligned in terms of policies. Thank you for this response. We got also some more technical questions, specifically when you were talking about ORBAC and the fact that you can use it at a resource level. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so basically, the role-based access control, you will define that either at the subscription level, at the resource group level, or at the resource itself. So namely, we can use a group, which is a virtual grouping of resources together, or if it's too broad of still, you can just say, okay, I just share this VM with this user in my organization. Or well, what I see quite often is we have an enterprise subscription, and then we have one partner which is operating on basically a specific resource group for the deployment of a specific service. Then you would delegate, for instance, the role of this partner as a contributor, so then he can create and delete resources just within the resource group, and but cannot manage anything around the access on the subscription or on the resource group. So that's basically just a way to simply grant access and collaborate.
Okay, great. There is more a question, obviously, on the licensing part. So this is one I can take it. It was the question of if you can use your Windows Server licenses in Azure. The response is yes, if you actually subscribe to the software assurance, where you have an offer which is called Azure Use Benefit, Immediate Use Benefit, basically where you have been able to use your licenses you have on-premise from Windows Server in Azure with some role of correspondence. And in this case, when you are activating these benefits, you just pay for the cost of the base VM, which is equivalent to a Linux VM cost. So you can do a lot of savings by activating this benefit if you have a software assurance. There was also additional questions, Arno, about blob storage, and if you can connect to iOS apps retrieving image from Azure Blob Services. Is this something which is possible?
So yeah, this is very possible. So you basically create a blob service. So it's important to mention the page blobs are dedicated to a virtual hard disk drive, and the page blobs are usually private. Usually, when you want to basically, for instance, use a couple of images, or you can store them on a blob environment, and you need to specify that the container is basically public. So every time you create a container inside the page the blob storage, then you have to specify the level of access that you authorize from the outside or inside. And then you can basically, once you define it as public, put your images, put static resources like PDF files, like any kind of content that is static. You can put it there and use that. And once you have a huge amount of those data, and that it needs to be used across multiple geography, you can also use Azure CDN.
Okay, great. One question from Jay, previously in Philippines, asking for if we have a plan to deploy a data center in Philippines soon. So for this one, I can take it, Arno. So actually, we don't have any public roadmap on where we're going to deploy the next data center. But what you can consider so far, it's to contact a hoster which can basically host our Azure Stack solution, which is actually GA, generally available in Philippines. Azure Stack basically is a way to deploy Azure in a hoster data center, or it could be also in your own data center, in which we will be able to provision just the same way you do it on Azure, IaaS scenario on some PaaS scenario in some extent, when you are basically being able to host a line of business application in your own premises. So it's very interesting in case you need to have some regulation where you need to host locally your data, or if you have issue with response time on things like that. It could be a solution you can look at to basically be able to deploy your workload just the same way you deploy them in Azure. And as mentioned at the beginning by Arno, with a hybrid solutions, it really gives you a hybrid cloud model where you're going to balance your workloads between Azure public cloud and your local data center or your preferred hoster data center. Arno, a very good question we often have about how to implement a disaster recovery solution between on-premise VMware host and Azure. I think you can detail about that.
So this is a very good teaser for the last session of our series, actually. So yeah. Thanks for the question. But just to answer it in a nutshell, basically, yes, you have the total possibility to replicate VMware virtual machines to Azure, to fail over to Azure when a problem happens, and fail back to your data center whenever the disaster is resolved. So that's all part of Azure Site Recovery. And the question is how easy it is to implement that. Well, basically you deploy one additional virtual machine on your vCenter that will be acting as, let's call it the replication gateway. So this will be the guy that consolidates all the data from your different machines that you want to replicate to Azure. Then this guy will replicate the data to Azure. And then you can restart, once the replication of those VMs is completed, then you can restart those machines on Azure. So you can restart that in a test environment, or you can restore that in a planned restore environment. So what is very important when you do disaster recovery is not only the replicating the machine, but all the dependencies. So you can have a planned disaster recovery environment where you put your VMs running, where you define a sequence order of restarting the virtual machine, restarting the different components of a service. For instance, restart Active Directory, do a couple of manipulation, verify the integrity, restart SQL Server, then start your application, your web application. So you define that that order of tasks. And when the disaster is finished, then basically you take the VM, so you shut down the VM in Azure as they're running, you replicate it back to your data center via either the express route basically link from your data center to Azure, so that's a high bandwidth SLA-based connectivity, or you can use VPN site-to-site to replicate back to your data center as well. And after the transfer is complete, then you will find back in your data center the VM as they were with the data on Azure.
Okay, great. So I think we respond to most of the questions. Feel free to post additional one. We'll have a look to the chat. And I would say in terms of call to actions, I highly recommend you to register to the next sessions. For you to know, this session is recorded and will be available also as a recorded session, so you can also push it to your colleagues or any person would be interested in this session to listen to it. And we will also, as a post-event summary, share with you the content of the slide deck and the demo. Thank you very much for attending this call today, and we wish you a good end of week. Bye.